Again, we're going to start on the penultimate presentation by Professor Karen Hardy of ICREA. She's a research professor, ICREA research professor at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, Spain, and she's going to be talking to us today about omnivorous Neanderthals, plants as food, medicine and raw materials in the Middle Paleolithic.
Thank you very much. So I was going to say thanks, but there's actually no one here to say thank you to, so I'll do that at the end. So anyway, I'm going to be talking about, the title is fairly nonsensical, I've just discovered this week, but never mind. I'm going to be talking, covering a sort of broad range of things. I had to decide whether I was going to go in great detail into something, because obviously plants is a huge subject, or give a complete sort of overview of the whole issue of plants and plant evidence, and here they are, so I can say thank you. It's okay. No, I just wanted to say that this is the first time I've been invited to Gibraltar. It's the first time I've been to Gibraltar, and I'm delighted to be here, and this is a wonderful conference, and thank you very much. So I'm going to start off by presenting the actual evidence that there is. That is, you'll see I'm actually putting it up on tables just really to demonstrate that how little evidence, actual evidence we have for the use of plants, and I'm covering the whole of the Lower and Middle Paleolithic. I'm then going to go back, and this involves some deconstruction into basic principles, because I think, and the way we work is that we start from essentials, what you can't live without. And so that's what I'm really going to be looking at today, particularly in terms of carbohydrates. And then looking at some of the plant properties, and then I'm going to end by looking at ways, the importance of incorporating plants in all aspects of plants, their use, their technology and their food, into models and into the work that's been conducted about Neanderthals, because they're so absolutely essential. So I better get going. So I'm starting off by saying that one of the problems, I think, in terms of incorporating plants is our sense of awe. Okay, we have lost the traditional ecological knowledge that plant use requires, and we are, in fact, the only animals that exist, modern Western human populations, who aren't able to survive in our natural environments. It's gone. This traditional ecological knowledge has now been replaced by social knowledge, so that Mr. Juncker can do whatever you like in terms of wheeling and dealing and negotiating and things, but put him in a field full of plants and he would simply die of starvation, or most likely poison himself, actually. So some of the other reasons why, I'm just running through some of the reasons why plants are so absent. Obviously, one is this lack of our misunderstanding about how they found it so probably easy. Secondly, of course, as everyone knows, it is the lack of evidence, the fact that dietary reconstruction, for obvious reasons, have traditionally been based on what was there, lithic bones, and obviously stable isotopes. And just to quickly mention this term top-level carnivores, which I think was a very unfortunate term. I have to say that in all the work that Richards and Trinkaus did, they always stressed that they were only looking at protein, at the protein level of part of the diet. But this, let's say, soundbitey term, top-level carnivores, was adopted, and people ran with it without really looking into it in more detail. And I think it's done a lot of damage, and we're still working very hard to deconstruct this based on that. So that's another reason. And finally is, of course, the lack of actual evidence. And so I always use this. I think it's really useful. It is, of course, from a much more recent time period and things, but actually the principles are exactly the same. Sites with excellent survival of plant materials outnumber stone tools by a factor of 20. In anaerobic conditions, 95% of all artifacts are made from plant materials. And in terms of chimpanzee tool use, as you can read there, stone tools against plant tools, you get 78 to 83% of tools made on plant materials, as against 11 to 18% for stone. And as McGrew, who I'm sure everyone knows, has made absolutely clear, most of these would not enter the archaeological record. And so we're starting from well below zero. And finally, as soon as stone tools came along, everyone got very, very excited indeed, because you had something you could measure and evaluate and use for cognitive development, for brain development, for technological development and everything. And plants seem to have just been forgotten. They dropped out of the picture. Before that, all the Australopithecines were defined on the types of plant foods and things that they ate. And of course, as Hervé said, the other problem is that there aren't any C4 plants in Europe, so it's very much more difficult to do. So now I'm going to start literally just giving a run through. This isn't everything. This doesn't include things like bedding, and it doesn't include African material, which has been very well published by Wadley a few years ago. So this is just to show there's a repetition of certain things. Spear tips, obviously, related to hunting, but digging sticks also, which obviously is related most likely to digging probably tubers and underground storage organs. And some of this very new material has just come up. And so that's very exciting. In terms of composite technology, as has been mentioned a few times before, pitch, bitumen, and I'm going to talk about fibres again in a minute. I know Francisco's is a little bit sceptical, but they're there. And so bitumen and pitch. Now, these occur on several sites. They're quite well known. And so I'm just going to to clarify, because bitumen and pitch are two totally different materials, and there is a little bit of confusion in the literature and sometimes among people as to what they are. Bitumen is a natural oil shale that simply seeps out in different places. It dries up, and it can be sort of softened and chewed and things, and can be used to haft, as it is when it's heated. Pitch, obviously, as everyone knows, is recovered from bark through a very complex technological process called dry distillation pyrolysis, or oxygen-free fire, and it is soft and pliable by heated. This is a paper that just came out last year. It's the last of many experimental papers discussing experimental ways of how Neanderthals could actually extract this type of pitch. They did lots of experiments, and I think the third one, the bottom one, produced as much pitch as you would need to haft lots of different tools. And so while it looks fairly complex, one of the main problems is that you have to have a recipient for the pitch that drops out. And where did this recipient come? How did they make this recipient? Well, obviously, they were able to make it out of birch bark. I don't think it's that complicated. But so anyway, this is just the sort of latest thing in terms of how to get your pitch. So this is just some work that we did at El Cedron in Asturias. We did dental calculus work based on we extracted chemical compounds from one sample in which we had evidence for both bitumen and for conifer resin, which was really exciting. And then it turned out that this same sample had very degraded toothware that Antonio Rosas had already said was indicative of a very exceptionally specialized behavior. So we believe that the person was actually chewing the bitumen and the pitch to soften it, which is a way to do it in order to have to use it for hafting. So this is the one that, this is the only evidence as far as that I have been able to find for the use of fibres in the Middle Paleolithic. I understand there's slight confusion. What Francesco said is there's a slight confusion as to the stratigraphy of this. I found this in an obscure French publication. I have not been able to go and visit the material. I've tried quite hard, but I haven't managed to do that. And so this is all this is all there is. However, I would like to say that fibre technology did not appear ready-made. It's a very, very complex technology requiring an incredibly extensive cognitive technological development. And so I'm just going to quickly run through it, the other evidence that there is for cordage. So obviously this is Francesco's work. Pete mentioned fibres for stitching clothes. If you stitch, you've got to have fibres, you've got to have the material to stitch with. And also water transport, which is obviously really important. Again, there's no absolute evidence. Jeff Bailey was telling me that he's not really sure. He believes the Eastern Mediterranean islands, the sites from the Eastern Mediterranean islands. However, there is, and obviously Australia wasn't Neanderthals, but I think that taking it together, I think we probably will in the end find that fibres probably were being developed and used, twisted fibre technology that is, by Neanderthals. So I'm just going to quickly run through the actual process of twisting fibres. It's a very complex process. You have to, and I would say that all the twisted fibres that have been found from the 30th, 40th millennium onwards in Europe are based on inner bast, lime bast, lime bast, oaks, I think, and juniper, Bruce was saying, and so on. And it has great implications for behaviour, for movement, and for cognitive development and everything. So first of all, you have to take off the bark, then you have to ret it. And the retting basically involves degrading all the chemical compounds that hold the materials together. And the way to do it is to soak it for weeks and weeks and weeks on end in a pond or in some water. There are other ways of doing it more quickly at different times of the year, but to do that, you have to be able to you have to understand the whole technology and the whole structure of the wood and everything. Then you separate it all. Then you get your fibrous materials, which is the bast. Then you dry the fibres, and then you're ready to get going. And then you have to start twisting it. So this is material. It's a work I did a few years ago with Paul Silito, and the twisting of fibres you cannot do standing up. It's very, very complicated. It's very, very, very time-consuming. And basically, the problem is once fibre technology was developed, was discovered, it was constantly in demand. It forms the essential part of all composite technology. Everything, if you look around yourselves, until the invention of wireless, every single thing that we used was based on fibres. And so basically, from the development of fibre technology up to probably the 19th century or earliest 20th century, people, probably women, but I'm just saying that possibly, were absolutely and totally tied to making fibres because of the constant demand, because you're not only making it, you're having to mend things and do things all the time. So fibre technology, it was basically slavery whenever it started. And I do believe that it was at least being developed during Neanderthal times. There's no way around it. I mean, it's just constant. Wherever you look, if you look in Shetland with the knitters, or if you look in Papua New Guinea with the bag makers, it's the same story. So here, I'm going to move on now to food. That was just a quick business about technology. I'm really talking about plant foods today. So this is the actual evidence. You've got a repetitive celtus seeds. This is partly due to their survival mechanisms, because due to biomineralization, they have preferential survival. So it doesn't mean to say that's all they were eating. It means to say that's what was surviving. Two works that I did, Cima del Elefante, we extracted microfossils. We did try to get chemical compounds out of the dental calculus, but we failed. I think it was simply too old. There just wasn't any surviving. But we got two different starchy plants. I'm going to talk about starchy plants in a minute. The only way you can distinguish or identify at all in any way starch plants from starch granules is the differentiation between unimodal distribution and bimodal distribution, which occurs in a small number of species or families. Genera. And the second one was at Kesem Cave, where we did manage to extract chemical compounds. And this is really, I think this is one of the most exciting things ever, because we extracted evidence for alpha-linoleic and linolenic acids, which these are polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're essential polyunsaturated fatty acids, and they only occur in plants. We think that it was probably pine nuts. We didn't publish the fact that it was pine nuts because we weren't 100,000% sure. But we're almost sure it was pine nuts, so that didn't go into our publication. But it's very exciting because it shows unequivocally, absolutely unequivocally, that this comes from plants. It's not surprising, as you're going to see in a while, because we wouldn't be here if our lower Paleolithic ancestors hadn't eaten plants. But I'm going to show you that in a while. So that's just that. Moving on to the Middle Paleolithic, it's the same. There's quite a lot of evidence. I don't believe there's enough evidence to reconstruct for dietary reconstruction, and particularly given, of course, the extremely long time periods, because this is covering everything. It's huge amounts of time, particularly in the lower Paleolithic. So as I'm sure everyone knows, we found this evidence for medicinal plants in El Cedron that was then consolidated by Laura Weyrich et al. Later on, who found more evidence for more medicinal plants and also other things as well, pathogens and so on, which was really exciting. So now I'm going to start doing a little bit of deconstruction. And as Carla's mentioned, sometimes when you're beginning with a brand new or a relatively new method or a new technique, you get a bit overexcited at the beginning. And so that happened in DNA, and he mentioned also that it happened in paleoproteomics. And I have to say that it happened also in starch granules extracted from dental calculus. So, as I'm sure everyone who works with Neanderthals know, there were some very wild claims made based on this starch and phytolith dental calculus work conducted out of the Max Planck. And I'm afraid I'm about to take it all to bits. There was a real lack of understanding of what was going on. You cannot reconstruct diet for hundreds of thousands of years based on 2 or 3 starch granules that you find in 2 or 3 samples of dental calculus. So because there's such a confusion about dental calculus work, I'm just going to quickly run through exactly what it's all about. So there are different methods. The first method is morphological, which is what the Max Planck use. They simply degrade the material, put it on microscope slides, use it, and compare it to modern reference collections, and then say that they've identified things. So having said that, starch is unlikely to be hailed as airborne particles, and to be fair to this group, they did put plants on the agenda. I would say that, it really did raise the profile of plants, and well done to them for doing that. In fact, the microfossils, the stuff that's degraded, and you can see on the microscope slides, really has more to do with inhalation of microenvironmental contamination. Particles up to 70 microns are inhaled. We do inhale particles up to 100 microns. So whenever I'm out and about now, if there's ever a car or anything goes by, I just automatically, I can't help it, I put something over my mouth because we're just inhaling it all. It's all going into our lungs. And when you start working on stuff like this, you realize quite how bad it is. And so those are just some examples. We do get pollen, which is very good. In Cima del Elefante, we got pollen, and there wasn't a lot of pollen, so that was really exciting. So we were able to actually give them some paleo-environmental data that they didn't have. Spores are not evidence of mushroom consumption, as has been claimed. They are, fungal spores are all over the place, and you just inhale them. This is stuff you can, this is some potential that I think still needs to be developed. Cultural and technological activities can also be obtained from this morphological analysis. This is work that we did. We identified a piece of non-edible conifer wood that we believe probably was used in oral hygiene. There's an awful lot of evidence from chimpanzees that I won't be showing today for the use of things to clean your teeth out between your teeth and things, and of course there's all the interproximal grooves from a lot of the Paleolithic specimens and previous, and of course the evidence for chewing stuff, hafting and so on. So those are sort of some of the things. Analytical methods. This is what we do. We do the TDGCMS and the PYGCMS, which is I'm not going to go into. It's a complicated. It's a sort of more complex. A specific use of GCMS work that allows us also to look at extremely small samples. So we've had lots of really nice results from that, but it gives you very specific results. Okay, you get chemical compounds that are identifiable. This is not morphological, this is not comparable, they are actually identifiable. So it's completely different. And then, of course, all the work that's been done on DNA. Laura Weyrich I think this is the only work that's been done on Paleolithic material, but she was able to consolidate our work by actually discovering penicillin, and also was able to reproduce several pathogens, which is brilliant too. So starch is the major carbohydrate of nutritional importance and comprises up to 70% of the world's diet today. Now, this is really important because it means that it's incredibly well studied, economically important, as Peter said the other day about pigs. I'm not going to go where the carbohydrate chemists dare not to go. So I work with a carbohydrate chemist all the time, and he keeps me right, and we work together. So one of the problems is that every time we eat anything, we're ingesting billions, literally billions of starch granules. So the small amount, which can be 1 to 50 or 60 starch granules that you get in a piece of dental calculus, are absolutely meaningless in terms of lifelong diet. They're nonsensical. The other thing is, of course, is using modern reference material to compare with material that's extracted from Paleolithic samples is also meaningless, because they have probably gone through, apart from the fact that each microenvironment produces a plant that grows to in a different way and to a different level and so on, there are actually potential for epigenetic changes, so you can't really compare modern plants at the granule level to ancient material. And this is what we did when we tried to identify plants. So that was our best guess. It was work we were doing at Çatalhöyük, and that was as good as we could get using thousands of different variables. And so you can't really identify plants from starch granules either. And of course, then you have all the story about food stickiness. Everyone has eaten sticky rice and dry rice. This has all an enormous effect on what type of material gets embedded in dental calculus, because certain foods are much more sticky and they stick about in the mouth more quickly, for longer than other foods. And finally, cooking, I'm afraid. Cooking simply cooking absolutely destroys starch granules, because the minute a starch granule is affected, is destroyed, is compromised in any way at all, what happens is, and this is what happens when the material is cooked, it simply starts to degrade, and this is what we eat, this is what we get this is what our food ends up looking like, and the reason it makes it obviously much more susceptible to amylase attack. So this is what happens. I've got a lovely series of images that someone gave me. This is actually how starch granules get degraded by alpha amylase. This is pancreatic, but it's the same. So you put something in your mouth, you chew it, the starch granules start getting destroyed, the alpha amylase starts burrowing in, and it starts eating it from the inside out. So that by the time you swallowed it, it looks like that. So it simply doesn't survive. It can't, and this is a raw one. If you're talking about cooked ones, obviously the process you're starting here, so by the time you're swallowing it or by the time you're chewing it, it's already disintegrated. So to summarize, this is basically what the actual archaeological evidence for plant foods comprises are seeds, nuts, fruits, olives, starchy foods, mushrooms, legumes, uses of secondary compounds for non-nutritional purposes, and a few other things, but not an awful lot. And then, of course, we have other archaeological evidence for a broad diet. This has all been discussed before: large mammals, leopards, birds, tortoises, riverfish, marine resources, mammals and shellfish. But I don't think this together gives us enough to actually start reconstructing the diet. Then there's the genetic evidence for plant consumption, the AMY1 salivary amylase gene, which was multiplied at some time after 700,000 years ago. The importance of this is that the amylase gene, with the multiplied amylase gene, is much more efficient and much more effective, an effective way of degrading the starch when it's in the mouth. And there has been a link between cooking, the timing of cooking, and the degradation, the duplication of the AMY1 gene. This is still up in the air a bit. It's sometime after 700,000 years. We said we thought it was around 700,000 years. I think that might have been brought down to around 400 now, but that's still under study. And obviously this is Carles's work, the bitter taste perception gene. The bitter taste perception gene is absolutely essential for plant exploitation, as it's a way to detect poisons. Toxic plants are so abundant that in order to be able to exploit plants, identification of plants is quite simply essential, because otherwise you would die within the first half an hour, because there are so many toxic plants. So basically, plant use is knowing what not to eat, which is crucial to survival, rather than knowing what to eat. And of course, there is the dental microwear work, which demonstrated, as everyone knows, that diets changed according to the environment, and also this wonderful, absolutely wonderful work of Hervé's. This is just a tiny example of it, which is changing the way we understand stable isotopes. So now I'm just going to go back to some first principles, going beyond the archaeological evidence. Oh no, I'm not yet. Early Homo dietary reconstruction is based on some assumptions, and these are that there was a high aerobic capacity, therefore they had high energy requirements. That the developing in early Homo case, or in the case of Neanderthals, large brain also had high energy requirements. That there have been no changes in digestive physiology since about 1.8 million years ago. That they had the capacity to withstand ecological shock, and therefore they were adaptable, and that they were not obligate carnivores. Therefore, they had to consume a proportion of something other than meat to counter the high levels of nitrogen and obtain the essential nutrients. So these are the basic principles. 20 to 25% of adult basic metabolic expenditure is used to keep the brain functioning, which means that modern humans require a reliable source of glycemic carbohydrate. This is all modern human, based on modern humans, but we haven't changed, really, in terms of what we need to eat. So altogether, the body requires around 170 grams of glucose per day to function, including for the brain, red blood cells, and reproductive organs. For low-active people, that is around 30 to 40 minutes of general physical activity per day, 3 times a week. That represents 1,800 to 2,400 kilocalories. For elite athletes, that goes up to 12,000 calories per day of carbohydrates that they need in order to function. That is enormous. It's far greater than their extra need for fat or for anything else. And the limited glycogen stores in the body will only last for approximately 90 minutes to 3 hours during moderate to high intensity exercise. That is, after that, your body's you've exhausted all your carbohydrate stores and you have to get some more. And finally, wild animal fats, which some people suggest could be used, are actually different from today's farm animal fats. The dietary protein limit is 35 to 40%, and farm animals today have a much higher amount of solid, highly saturated fat, while wild animals are leaner and generally have much less fat, so that would have been possibly less useful. And finally, the need for very long-chain omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, such as docosahexaenoic acid, was critical, as I'm sure everyone knows, for the structural components of brain, retina, and essential for the growth and functional development of the brain in infants and for normal brain functioning. So now I'm going to quickly look at reproduction. When people do dietary reconstruction, they tend to focus on young athletic adults, but populations were not all hyper-athletic young adults. These are the most important people, and there are some interesting little facts here. Fetal growth is directly correlated with maternal glucose concentration, which means that larger infants are born to women with higher blood glucose, and more shockingly, really, there is a link between maternal gestational ketonomia, that is insufficient carbohydrates, and a reduced offspring IQ, which means that if you don't eat enough carbohydrates, your child is less intelligent than you are. So unless you're actually going downhill, you have to, the pregnant women simply absolutely have to eat carbohydrates to a certain extent, and probably and a lot more than the absolute minimum of 170 grams. So to summarize, Neanderthals and other hominins had to eat lots of carbohydrates in order to have energy to reproduce, to keep their big brains running. And while the archaeological evidence for this is not significant, but if you combine it with some basic physiological and nutritional data, it allows us to start to build a more balanced picture of their dietary needs and therefore where we start from. So I get lots and lots of questions. Often the questions are the same questions each time, so I'm just going to answer them now. One is a lack of plants in high latitudes. That's one that comes up quite often. Now, Bruce did a very nice publication in 2010, actually listing all the different plants that were available. I've looked in the Antarctic. In the Antarctic, currently, in the most inhospitable place in the world, there are approximately 800 plants, that is lichens, fungi, and things. Now, I don't know what the edibility of these are, but they come from families with a lot of edible and medicinal plants in them. And this is a very nice little publication that I discovered recently about the plant food consumption from some modern whale hunters from Beringia. That's their climate. It's subarctic maritime climate, tundra. Average temperature summer is 5 degrees. Their plant species diversity is between 200 and 300, and today they eat around 30 different species of plants, and these are just some of them. Next question. High Arctic populations survived without plants. That's everyone's favourite. So I'm just going to explain this. Many people in the high Arctic populations have a thing called the CPT1A gene Arctic variant, which enables them to be in a state of permanent gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is a metabolic pathway whereby glucose synthesis occurs in vivo from non-carbohydrate sources, and this keeps the blood glucose levels from dropping too low, and people who've got diabetes know all about this. Gluconeogenesis occurs during fasting, low carbohydrate intake, or intense exercise, and every one of us here will have experienced gluconeogenesis. Pregnant women are in a basically permanent state of gluconeogenesis. Whenever you've gone a little bit too far and done a little bit too much exercise and you feel a little bit woozy and your brain goes a bit fuzzy, that's because your brain isn't getting enough carbohydrate, enough glucose. And so basically what happens is it stops functioning. It starts just simply dropping in functional level, and then you get wobbly legs, or I do, and so on and so on. The positives of gluconeogenesis are that it's a fail-safe mechanism for the rest of us. This is, by the way, why Arctic populations have such incredible problems nowadays with the modern Western healthy diet that they're supposed to be eating, because their bodies simply can't cope with it. So the positives of gluconeogenesis, so if you're thinking about a group of Neanderthal hunters, it prevents rapid death from lack of essential carbohydrates. It enables, when the body has depleted its glucose resources, it switches to this emergency response, which keeps people alive. However, it does compromise energy levels. It's much more energy expensive. It affects cognitive abilities, and it affects reproductive rates. And if you look at the reproductive rates of Arctic populations, you will see that this matches the gluconeogenesis. It also causes problems with the kidneys for obvious reasons, and there is a risk of ketosis, which usually kicks in after 3 to 4 days of eating less than 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. And this is, of course, very dangerous indeed. So there's plenty of capability for people to have gone off and gone on hunting trips and things and managed to survive for a few days without eating carbohydrates, but long-term, not. Next question, you can get carbs from animals. Now this one, this was Chris Stringer, who was the first person to respond to that. He published a paper saying that, no, I was wrong. Actually, all he needed to do was open up the stomach and eat chyme. Well, apart from the fact that actually chyme is the partially digested contents of herbivores' stomachs, and grass and things really doesn't contain an awful lot of carbohydrates. So that's one problem. Second problem is that, unfortunately, they hadn't done their homework, and they used, I think it was red deer as a proxy, as an example, and red deer actually specifically avoid the yarrow, which was the bitter tasting plant that we had found, because they don't like it, and so they actually go around it and don't eat it. And so I then, myself and others, we published a response to that in 2016, and he's been very quiet since. And the other thing is muscle glycogen, which is, yes, it's useful in cold climates. It's very useful indeed for in the Arctic. However, and I'm sure that the animal people know an awful lot more about this than I do, animal glycogen doesn't replace the need for carbohydrates elsewhere, as glycogen is used up when animals are stressed, i.e. during hunting, it simply converts immediately into lactic acid, which destroys the meat. And so it is not a replacement except in the Arctic, and it was very important in the Arctic and part of their diet. So now I'm going to move to some of the wacky claims, and the only reason I'm really doing this is because this is a paper that is currently in press in quaternary science reviews. I was so shocked about it that I'm actually raising it because I don't know what's going on in QSR, but this kind of stuff shouldn't be being published. So these are some of the claims. The first one I said, animal glycogen replaced the need for carbohydrates. And I would just like to say that when you're talking about diets, there's a lot of wackiness involved. And the reason I think that there's a lot of wackiness involved is because it's very multidisciplinary. You get people coming from the outside who are not archaeologists, who put their pennyworth in, but they don't understand the context. You have to understand the full picture. So I work with nutritionists and I work with all sorts of people, but we always work together. So we all put our things in together and we are able to reconstruct the picture, or to try to construct a picture. But when you've got a guy who is coming from a biologist or whatever he is, coming from somewhere else, and trying to say that they've lost the context, they don't understand the whole context, and so there is a lot of wacky. And so in this case, this is some of the things that have been said, that the Neanderthals focused on juvenile animals in order to get at the stomach contents, which are rich in curdled milk, and they forgot about the lactase gene there, I think. Neanderthals didn't hunt, they scavenged and practiced opportunistic hunting so that they didn't need extra carbohydrates required for high energy pursuits. Now, I'm only saying this because this is in press today. On essential polyunsaturated fatty acids, this is one that was published last year based on published food sources. There is a lack of omega-3 fatty acids and ascorbic acid. This was resolved by cannibalism. In addition to the bodies obtained from natural death, some members of the hominin group would probably have been selected for ritual sacrifices to be eaten. Perhaps this situation could be related to the origin of symbolism associated with totemic meals and related moral and religious practices. If anyone would like to follow up on that, please go ahead. It's in press. Oh no, that one's 2017 QSR. Finally, the wackiest of all. This takes the biscuit. So in the Andes, if anyone remembers the Andes plane disaster in 1972, people survived by eating each other for 72 days. Therefore, Neanderthals did not need plants. I rest my case. So, finally, the need for DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, which, again, has been something that has been pushed a lot in early evolutionary diet as a limiting factor in brain development, and so on. But, in fact, while meat is a source of DHA, it can also be obtained directly from other dietary sources, or it can be synthesized from other fatty acids, such as linolenic acid, which I mentioned earlier. It was eaten by the people from Kasem Cave, and it's present in oil from ocean fish, eggs, seed oils, and so on. And something that's really interesting is, and relevant to everyone, all of us here, more DHA may be needed in the modern diet than there was in prehistory due to the abundance in the modern Western diet of omega-6 fatty acids, which inhibit a key enzyme step in the conversion of ALA to DHA. And there we go. So, evolutionary, that is pre-agricultural diet, omega-3 and omega-6 were approximately 1-to-1. Today, Western diet today, omega-3 to omega-6 is approximately 15-to-1. I think I've got that the wrong way around. I think it's 15 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. And this is incredibly unhealthy, besides everything else. And so we should be eating more oily fish, linseeds, and green vegetables, but we're not. And so this has led to a slight misunderstanding in terms of the perhaps an overemphasis on the need for DHA. And now for something completely different. So that's it, diet finished. I'm moving on to something else now. And I'm going to talk about plant secondary compounds. This is work that I'm doing. It's actually a paper that has taken such a long time to do. I didn't expect it to take so long. I don't think I would ever have started if I'd known it was going to take so long. But it's submitted at the moment and it's in review. Plant secondary compounds are arguably some of the most abundant and diverse naturally occurring toxins on Earth. They are complex chemicals that are not essential to the life of a plant. They're produced primarily as pesticides, anti-grazing agents, pigments, hormones, and chemical agents that can attack other plants. Those are examples: the tannins, which give you the taste of tea, the saponins, which rub up and make a sort of froth, which are used a lot in soaps and things, and the alkaloids, which have the nicotine and drugs and stuff like that, cannabis and all those sorts of things. So this is a little example I just want to show, because there's a very fine line between what's poisonous and what's medicinal, because this is obviously, I'm talking about medicinal here. So the use of PSCs is based on a very, very deep understanding of plants, and I think this is a really important point in terms of Neanderthal use of these, because you have to get the dosage right and you have to really understand the plant, otherwise you can just kill yourself. So there is a very fine line between medicine and poison, and I've used the example of Ricinus communis castor oil seed because it was found on arrow points at Sibudu. Was also, so it is found, ricin is only found in the coat of the plant, of the seed, only the coat. It's one of the most toxic substances known. I don't know if anyone remembers the Bulgarian who was shot in the London Underground by an arrow out of the end of his umbrella. The umbrella's not here, so I can't do it. Oh, well, there you go. Like that. And that was ricin. That was ricinoleic acid that killed him, dead. But the oil inside the seed is a highly medicinal product. It's specifically used. It's a laxative, but it's so effective that it's regularly used to clear the digestive tract in the cases of poisoning. So this is just a very good example of the depth of knowledge that is required in order to use medicinal plants, in order to understand the use of medicinal plants. So, of course, there is no way to prove that a plant was consumed for medicinal purposes, but I could also say that there's no way to prove that carbonized plants that are found, or carbonized, or for that matter, animal bones that are found on archaeological sites were consumed. It's just assumed that they are because they're food products. And so I kind of reject that, the argument that you can't actually prove it. One way to look at the broad-scale behavioral context of this and examine the likelihood that early hominins self-medicated is... Oh, sorry, I think I've got that wrong. Yes, it's look at the broad-scale behavior. We don't have the actual evidence. We know that. But if you place it within a bigger context, then I think I'm going to be able to show you in the next 10, 15 minutes, actually, that there is no way that they didn't self-medicate. So, first of all, just taking it from today, so I'm looking from forwards to backwards, there is a vast knowledge of ecological knowledge that is present today in non-industrial populations. And an awful lot of that is based on medicinal plant use. And if you look at the number of journals that are dedicated specifically and only to ethnographic uses of medicinal plants, it's absolutely vast. It's enormous. So food and medicine were often one and the same. Yes, this is the other thing. It's perceptions. In the West, the concept of food as nutrients separate from plants ingested deliberately for their medicinal qualities began in the Middle Ages with the suppression of entheogenic drugs, that is, psychedelic drugs. Until the development of modern medicinal drugs, many of which are based on concentrations of plant compounds, food and medicine were often one and the same, and medicinal foods were a normal part of our diet, and I won't put in the plug against the drug companies, because they've really pushed this very much indeed by their absolute pushing of pills and separation from food, because an awful lot of food, an awful lot of the dietary, an awful lot of the medicines we could actually eat without the need for pills. There's a very nice little thing that I found, which is that modern human love of medicinal drugs is so enormous, and I don't have the actual amounts here of money that is spent by modern Americans on drugs, medicinal drugs. But it's thought to have an evolutionary basis and is considered a universal adaptation of all animals, including humans, when physiological adaptations and behavioral avoidance are not enough. So it is universal among animals, and I include carnivores in that. So the topic of zoopharmacognosy was developed a long time ago, and I'm just going to show now, to provide a sort of behavioral context for the use of medicinal plants. Animals utilize plant secondary compounds or other non-nutritional substances to combat or control disease. All today's higher primates self-medicate, and most other animals do too. So this was a paper just on insects, simply demonstrating the extent of, and some of it obviously is deliberate, and I'm going to show some examples of chimpanzees who practice deliberate self-medication. In other cases, it's simply dietary alteration. When you're getting ready for reproduction, for when it's time to reproduce, then a butterfly or whatever it is might switch its diet to make itself more fertile. That's just an example. Of course, it's a very difficult thing to study, but there's more and more being studied and more being found out about it now. So this is just an example of chimpanzees and gorillas. Chimps eat and therefore know around 200 to 300 plants, of which 36 identify. There's been a huge amount of study done on this, and it's been incredibly specific because, probably most likely because it is so extremely difficult to prove. And so there's been an awful lot of study, very detailed study done on it. And in gorillas, gorillas eat, I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly how many plants gorillas eat and therefore know, but they are almost up there with the chimpanzees. And this is deliberate self-medication. This is going out, selecting a plant when they're not well to actually eat it. Another thing that's quite interesting is the food transfer between mothers and infants, and chimpanzees are more likely to practice vertical transmission, whereas gorillas are more likely to practice horizontal transmission because they are less, the chimpanzees are more, their guts are more like ours, and they have this, they don't have this big, huge hindgut that processes some of the toxins. Therefore, they're more likely to get poisoned. They're more like us in that we're more susceptible to toxins than gorillas are. And you can see it in the way that they learn about plants. So I'm just going to focus on one thing, parasite infestation. It's a constant threat. Today, almost 2/3 of the world's human population is infected at any given time by intestinal parasites, while around 16 million people in developing countries die each year from illnesses linked to these. Now, I do not believe that Neanderthals could have survived, or any early hominins, if they hadn't have known how to deal with this. It's quite simple, it's quite straightforward. There are certain things you can take that clean your gut out, which I'm going to show now with the chimpanzees. They would have lived, I'm obviously not going to assume how they lived, but we find a lot of evidence for animal food in and around their living areas and things. It would have been absolutely rife with pathogens. And they had to be able to deal with that, because otherwise they wouldn't have survived to reproduction, to be able to reproduce. They simply had to. And it's so fundamental, it's such a universal behavior among animals that of course they did it. They did not opt out of this. They did it, and we can show that they did it because they survived and because they lasted such a long time. So this is just a couple of examples of the type of self-medication practiced by chimpanzees and bonobos. They all respond to, this is chimpanzees, I think, in specific, these two examples. They all respond to seasonal intestinal worm infestations by selecting certain plants, even when they sometimes have to go way out of their way to collect them. And this plant that's used for bitter pith chewing, I think they have to go out of their territory. They have to go up into an area that they don't usually go into, and they go off on their own, and they get it, and they process it, and they prepare it, and they eat it, and they clean their stomach out. And leaf swallowing, they take the leaves. The leaves have they have spines on the outside of them. They fold the leaves so that the spines are on the outside, and then they swallow them whole, and the spines actually pick up the parasites as they go through the gut. So these are the two most best studied. Now, if anyone's interested, because it's not something that probably an awful lot of people have read about, Mike Huffman did a fantastic chapter in my Wild Harvest book, which if I can pass it on to anyone if they would like it. I've got it here, called An Ape's Perspective on Human Evolution, and it's great. Or an ape's perspective on plant self-medication or something. Oh, that's it. An ape's perspective on the origins of medicinal plant use in humans. So many animals, there's another direct correlation in many cases between animal use of medicinal plants and human use of medicinal plants. And Mike, actually in that chapter, described several occasions where people have seen an animal that's sick, they follow the animal that's sick, they see what plants the animal eats, then they go and take it themselves. When they get sick, they take it and they cure it, and that's how they incorporate more information into their own array or of medicinal plants. And so there's a real kind of interaction between the animals and the humans here. So this is just a quick summary of the extent of preventative and curative self-medication among animals. Eating for health, food preferences, that's more in the more kind of fundamental way. They ensure the correct minerals, as everyone knows. Sheep go and lick sheep licks because they have to. That's very obvious. Wound treating, they do actually treat wounds. They do dental floss. This is very, very widely widely known now, and they practice tooth and gum care. They vary their diet according to their fertility to make themselves more fertile. They cure sickness, and they get rid of parasite infestations. So how to identify? Now, this is a problem. Of course, there's very, very little evidence indeed. I have to mention Lev et al., who really was the first person to actually identify this as a specific and deliberate action, and he picked out and noted 14 plants with medicinal properties in their assemblage, which is absolutely great. He's the first person to have done it. And then, of course, the work that we did on the dental calculus has identified more. This is work that I'm doing at the moment. It's taken me a huge amount of time. I've gone through all the plant assemblages for all these different sites, and I've gone through and got the proportional medicinal and edible properties of every single plant from all these assemblages. And this is just one tiny little bit of it, but I thought I would just show it. And what I've shown is that consistently in all the sites, and that is from Neolithic up to Low Paleolithic, there is a much greater proportion of plants with medicinal properties in the archaeological assemblages than occurs naturally either in the world, in China, which has the greatest proportion of medicinal plants, or plants with medicinal properties in the world, and even among chimps. And so humans have built on this animal behavior and developed it. And I think that, well, I hope that this plus all the work that I've done, I hope it'll be out this year at least. It's in review at the moment. Well, second review actually, so hopefully we're nearly there. Finally, this is just a wee little thing that I wanted to mention. Obviously, when you're moving into new environments or when your environments change, you have to be able to cope with new communities of plants. And chimpanzees have this combination between neophobia and neophilia that is very similar to our difference between people who are shy and people who are very extrovert. And unsurprisingly, the extroverts, the ones with curiosity, tend to be the adolescents. No surprise there. And they believe that they're suggesting that this is obviously a way to, it's a behavioural thing because the young adolescents have to go out into new environments and things. But I think that this probably demonstrates that a way that hominins could actually develop and expand their plant usage without actually poisoning themselves. I was going to say something else. I've forgotten what I was going to say there, but never mind. It's gone. Never mind. So just to demonstrate how much this is growing, this is simply what was on the news last week. Okay, that's just 1 week. So I found this, I don't know if anyone have seen this, the possible evidence for care and treatment in the Tyrolean Iceman. They've suggesting now that the tattoos that were found on him were actually match identically the acupuncture points. And so they're now suggesting that acupuncture was practiced. Obviously this is much more recent, but there it is. And last week there was this fantastic video that I wanted to put up, but I couldn't work out how to do it, of baboons being filmed flossing their teeth with bristles and hairs. So this is practicing cleaning, oral hygiene, and so on. So to summarise, what can plants tell us about Neanderthals? Oh, that's wrong, sorry. What plants can tell us about Neanderthals and plants? That's not quite right. Anyway, they had extensive ecological knowledge that underpinned complex technology and complex dietary practices. They had mechanisms for surviving and moving into new environments with different plant populations. They had a very sophisticated understanding of material properties of plants and the technological ability to manipulate these. And if we go along with the fibre technology, they had a need for forward planning for some length of time in one place and for an understanding of seasonal variation in fibre-based properties. So how to develop a better understanding of the use and implications of plants? Well, I would suggest that we need to do some analysis on fibre technology, and I've already suggested it, Francesco. I don't know how enthusiastic he is, but we could look at the traces in the insides of the holes in the beads. I'm sure it's really complex, but I think it would be a great thing to do. I do believe that genetics will help to sort a few things out. Everyone, I'm sure, knows the lactase gene. I mentioned the the high Arctic variant, and so on. And I think genetics certainly is a way to go. And of course, we need more information on actual ingested food, medicine, and microbial information, and so on. And finally, why is it such a topic? The reason I think that diet really is something that gets people going is because it affects all of us. Okay, as everyone knows, obesity is a global epidemic, and there are all the associated illnesses related to that. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer are directly related to diet. And we don't really know what we should be eating. And when I was preparing this talk, I just went onto Google and I typed a few things in, like carbs versus fats, and should we eat carbs? And a few things like that. On every single page, I got just one page, I got total opposite, a website saying completely and totally opposite things. So I think that that's why people don't know. When we published The Importance of Dietary Carbohydrate in Human Evolution, I had doctors, I'm a social scientist, I had doctors emailing me from all over the world saying, please advise me on what I should tell my patients to eat. Incredible. We also made enemies of the paleo diet community, which I'm sure you're not surprised about. By the way, paleo diet is a copyrighted word for a commercial diet, so don't use it because you might get put in jail. Yeah, it's quite important. It's quite an interesting thing to think about, that before it was actually about getting enough energy, and now it's about having too much. So I was just going to say, with the paleo diet people, they really attacked us. They attacked us in the press, they attacked us on their websites and everything. And so we formulated a reply to them, and we sent it to them and said, you know, you've put all this stuff out, this is for your Facebook pages or whatever. And we tried to upload it on their Facebook pages, and we were blocked. We'd been blocked onto their Facebook pages, and we never got that reply uploaded onto any of their paleo diet Facebook pages. So Mark Thomas from King's College in London, UCL, set up a page in his webpage and put all the paleo diet stuff in there, and he put our response in there, and he put all there was a huge lot of press about it, and so on. And so it's all there if anyone wants to go and have a look at it. But obviously we're the enemies of the paleo diet people. I don't think we're the only ones, but anyway, there you go. So thank you very much. And obviously this work involves an awful lot of other people. Thank you.